July 18, 2011, 10 a.m. The final Waldenbooks locations across America unlocked their doors for the last time. Liquidation banners screamed, "Everything must go." Inside, shelves that once held millions of stories were stripped bare, while longtime employees quietly packed away 78 years of retail history. Just 2 decades earlier, this was an unstoppable empire. Waldenbooks was the undisputed king of mall culture, the first bookstore chain to conquer all 50 states with over 1,200 locations. They didn't just sell books, they democratized reading, placing paperbacks next to food courts and fashion outlets, making literature accessible to everyday Americans on Saturday afternoon shopping trips. Now, the bustling aisles have gone completely dark. The familiar green and white signs were ripped down, leaving only faded outlines on mall walls. A multi-million-dollar literary giant, completely erased from the map. How does the largest bookstore chain in America, a pioneer that defined consumer reading habits for generations, get swallowed whole by the very industry it helped build? It wasn't just the rise of Amazon, and it wasn't just the slow death of the American mall. It was a tragic saga of corporate cannibalism, fatal mergers, and a parent company that sacrificed its most loyal child to feed a superstore obsession. From a 3-cent rental library in the Great Depression to a devastating bankruptcy, this is the story of how America lost its neighborhood bookstore. The year was 1933. America was suffocating under the crushing weight of the Great Depression. The national unemployment rate had skyrocketed to a staggering 25%. Breadlines snaked around city blocks, and a palpable sense of economic despair hung heavy in the air of every major city. In this bleak, unforgiving landscape, buying a brand new hardcover book was an unimaginable luxury for the average American family. Books were widely considered expensive, sacred objects, mostly confined to the dusty, hushed aisles of traditional, intimidating bookstores in urban centers, or safely tucked away in the private studies of the wealthy. For the working class, literature was often physically and financially out of reach. But Lawrence Hoyt, a former sales manager for the publishing powerhouse Simon & Schuster, and his business partner, Melvin L. Levin, understood something fundamental about human nature. In times of profound crisis, people do not just need bread to survive, they need an escape. They need stories to temporarily lift them out of their harsh reality. Operating on a shoestring budget and a radical idea, Hoyt and Levin founded the Walden Book Company. The name was carefully and deliberately chosen, inspired by Henry David Thoreau's classic philosophical work, Walden, which chronicled a retreat into nature and a search for a simpler, more meaningful existence. Hoyt and Levin wanted to offer struggling Americans their own form of retreat, a mental and emotional escape from the grueling daily realities of the 1930s. However, they didn't start by selling books. Knowing their customers' empty pockets, they pioneered a rental library model. For just 3 cents a day, an American could rent a popular novel. They set up these rental libraries as small, unassuming concessions inside existing, high-traffic department stores across the Northeast. The concept was an overnight sensation. For 3 pennies, a factory worker, a struggling mother, or a teenager could borrow a ticket to another world, returning it when they were done. This seemingly modest business venture laid the early philosophical foundation for what the company would eventually become known for worldwide: a champion for the democratization of reading. To Lawrence Hoyt, books were not elite artifacts reserved for scholars. They were essential, accessible commodities meant for everyone. For nearly 3 decades, the Walden Book Company quietly thrived as a highly successful rental library business. But as the 1950s rolled into the 1960s, the fabric of American society underwent a seismic, irreversible transformation. The post-World War II economic boom brought unprecedented prosperity. the GY Bill helped create a massive, upwardly mobile new middle class, and the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 paved the way for the great American migration from dense, aging urban centers to the sprawling, idyllic new suburbs. With this mass migration came the birth of a new cultural and commercial phenomenon, the enclosed suburban shopping mall. Visionary architects were designing massive, climate-controlled retail hubs that served as the new town squares, social clubs, and weekend destinations for millions of suburbanites. Hoyt, possessing a keen instinct for retail evolution, noticed a distinct shift in his rental business. As the middle class grew wealthier, they no longer wanted just to rent books, they wanted to own them. Furthermore, the grand downtown department stores that traditionally housed his rental libraries were beginning to rapidly lose foot traffic to the shiny new suburban malls. Hoyt realized that if his company was to survive the changing tide of the 1960s, it had to evolve. It had to leave the 3-cent rental business behind, become a full-fledged retail operation, and follow the American family out to the suburbs. In 1962, the Waldenbooks Company took a monumental leap of faith. Inside the newly constructed Northway Mall in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the very first Waldenbooks retail store officially opened its doors. It was a radical departure from the traditional bookstore. Traditional shops were often dark, quiet, and intimidating, manned by stern clerks and tailored for serious academics. The Northway Mall Waldenbooks, by contrast, was bright, welcoming, and entirely unintimidating. It was strategically designed not as a destination for the elite, but to catch the eye of the casual, everyday shopper. Hoyt insisted on wide, open entrances with no doors, allowing the mall's ambient noise and foot traffic to spill naturally into the store. Inside, the design was revolutionary. Instead of dark wooden shelves packed tightly with spines facing outward, Waldenbooks utilized bright lighting and modern fixtures. They championed the face-out display, turning the colorful, sensational covers of mass-market paperbacks toward the main aisle to immediately grab a shopper's attention. These paperbacks were the perfect product for the new suburban lifestyle, cheap, portable, and disposable. You could buy a thriller or a romance novel for pocket change, toss it in a shopping bag, and read it on the patio. Waldenbooks completely removed the traditional gatekeeper mentality of the book trade. There was no judgmental clerk asking what scholarly text you were looking for. You could browse anonymously, comfortably, and freely. By placing books directly in the path of the suburban American consumer's weekend errands, Waldenbooks performed a quiet cultural revolution. That single store in Pittsburgh was an immediate, overwhelming success, proving Hoyt's theory correct. The American middle class was hungry for accessible literature. This solitary location in Pennsylvania was not just a new chapter for the company. It was ground zero for a retail explosion that would soon blanket the entire nation, forever altering the way America bought and read books. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the American landscape was being aggressively rewritten by concrete and glass. The enclosed suburban shopping mall was no longer just an architectural experiment. It had become the undisputed epicenter of American life. It was a climate-controlled utopia where teenagers loitered, families spent their entire Saturdays, and consumer capitalism found its most efficient, frictionless engine. And riding the absolute crest of this massive cultural wave was Waldenbooks. Following the runaway success of their Northway Mall location, the company's executives recognized a profound shift in consumer psychology. They understood that within the enclosed, high-stimulus ecosystem of a shopping mall, a bookstore could not survive by simply waiting for serious, intentional readers to seek it out. Instead, the store had to actively intercept the casual, strolling shopper. To do this, Waldenbooks completely re-engineered the retail psychology of selling books. Prior to Waldenbooks, the traditional book trade relied heavily on intent. You went to a bookstore because you knew exactly what you wanted to buy. But in the mall environment, Waldenbooks pioneered the art of the impulse literary buy. They achieved this by treating books not as sacred, intimidating texts, but as highly accessible, fast-moving consumer goods. Their real estate strategy was fiercely calculated. Waldenbooks aggressively negotiated leases for prime locations right next to major anchor stores like Sears or J.C. Penney, or strategically positioned themselves along the bustling, high-visibility corridors leading directly to the food court. They wanted to capture the overflow of foot traffic, tapping into the exhausted but willing minds of shoppers looking for a quick, affordable distraction. The physical design of the stores was a masterclass in reducing friction and lowering psychological barriers. They stripped away the heavy, dark mahogany woods and hushed, library-like atmosphere of historic urban bookstores. In their place came bright, almost aggressive fluorescent lighting that spilled out invitingly into the mall corridor. There were no heavy doors to push open. The entrance was a wide, welcoming maw that practically swallowed passing shoppers. Inside, the spatial layout was explicitly designed to stimulate immediate visual interest. Rather than forcing customers to tilt their heads and squint at thousands of narrow spines packed tightly on shelves, Waldenbooks heavily utilized the face-out display method. They took the most sensational, colorful covers of mass-market paperbacks and plastered them front and center on prominent end caps and cascading table displays. In a bustling retail space, these vibrant covers functioned as physical, psychological hooks, visual triggers specifically engineered to break a shopper's stride and grab their attention in a fraction of a second. A shopper walking by with a pretzel in hand would catch the embossed, glittering title of a Stephen King thriller or the sweeping, dramatic artwork of a Danielle Steele romance, and within seconds, the book was in their shopping bag. The mass-market paperback was the undisputed fuel of this rapid, nationwide expansion. These books were small, cheap to produce, and incredibly affordable. Waldenbooks stocked them by the thousands. They didn't prioritize highbrow literary fiction or dense academic texts. They stocked exactly what the masses actually wanted to read: sci-fi, fantasy, romance, mystery, and celebrity biographies. They understood that reading for the American middle class was largely about entertainment and escapism, not academic pursuit. Furthermore, Waldenbooks effectively centralized and dictated national reading tastes. The prominent bestseller wall near the front of every store became a self-fulfilling prophecy of consumer behavior. By placing certain titles in these high-visibility zones, Waldenbooks guaranteed their success, creating a synchronized reading culture where millions of people across different states were buying and discussing the exact same paperbacks at the exact same time. The staff, too, reflected this approachable ethos. You weren't greeted by an austere literary critic peering over half-moon spectacles. You were greeted by a local teenager or a friendly neighbor working a part-time retail shift. They didn't judge your purchase of a trashy romance novel, they simply rang it up with a smile. This egalitarian approach built immense brand loyalty. Families began to view Waldenbooks as a safe, reliable haven, a place where parents could drop their kids in the carpeted children's section while they browsed the latest thrillers nearby. This low-friction, high-visibility model turned Waldenbooks into an unstoppable expansion machine throughout the 1970s. While traditional independent booksellers sneered at the commercialization of the trade, the numbers told a different story. Waldenbooks was opening new locations at a staggering pace, sometimes cutting ribbons on multiple stores in a single week across different states. By the close of the decade, the company had transformed from a regional rental library into a national retail juggernaut. They had fundamentally rewired the American book market, proving that literature could be mass-marketed, just like any other household commodity. But this meteoric rise, fueled by the explosive growth of mall culture, was about to attract the attention of corporate giants looking for their next lucrative acquisition. The mom-and-pop era of Waldenbooks was ending, and the era of ruthless corporate retail was about to begin. The dawn of the 1980s ushered in the golden age of the American shopping mall, and reigning supreme over this neon-lit, climate-controlled kingdom was Waldenbooks. By this time, the company had evolved from a clever business concept into a ubiquitous cultural institution. They achieved a historic milestone that no other bookseller had ever managed. Waldenbooks became the very first bookstore chain to operate in all 50 United States. From the sprawling megamalls of Southern California to the enclosed retail corridors of snowy Maine, the familiar green and white sign was as guaranteed a presence as the aroma of hot pretzels or the chatter of the food court. During this era, Waldenbooks was not just riding the wave of consumerism. They were actively shaping the publishing industry. They possessed an unprecedented level of market power. A decision made by a buyer at the Waldenbooks corporate headquarters could instantly mint a national bestseller. Publishers vied aggressively for prime placement on the chain's highly coveted end caps and front-of-store tables. When blockbuster authors like Stephen King, Tom Clancy, or Danielle Steele released a new hardcover, Waldenbooks was the undisputed primary artery through which these stories pumped into the American mainstream. They were opening new locations at an astonishing rate, sometimes cutting ribbons on dozens of stores in a single month. To the outside observer, and even to the employees stocking the shelves, the empire seemed invincible. But sweeping success inevitably attracts corporate predators. In the early 1980s, Kmart Corporation was an absolute titan of American discount retail, seeking to diversify its massive portfolio beyond apparel and household goods. Kmart went on a spending spree, acquiring various specialty retail chains. They looked at Waldenbooks and saw a perfectly oiled, highly profitable machine. In 1984, Kmart officially acquired Waldenbooks for a staggering $295 million. At first, the acquisition was framed as a monumental victory. Harry Hoffman, the ambitious CEO of Waldenbooks at the time, viewed the Kmart buyout as an injection of limitless capital. With Kmart's deep pockets, Waldenbooks could expand even faster, upgrade its logistics, and experiment with new formats like the educational toy offshoot, Walden Kids. For a brief, shining moment, it appeared that the marriage between the nation's largest discount retailer and the nation's largest bookstore chain was a match made in commercial heaven. However, beneath the surface of this corporate triumph, a quiet, insidious shift began to alter the very DNA of Waldenbooks. The fundamental problem was a massive philosophical disconnect. Lawrence Hoyt had founded Waldenbooks on the belief that reading should be accessible, but he still understood that books were unique products requiring a specific kind of environment and care. Kmart, on the other hand, was fundamentally a discount merchandiser. To the executives sitting in Kmart's boardroom in Troy, Michigan, a book was no different from a toaster, a pair of blue jeans, or a garden hose. It was simply a unit of inventory, a barcode to be scanned, a commodity to be moved at the highest possible volume and the lowest possible margin. This supermarket mentality began to permeate the Waldenbooks culture. The parent company demanded relentless growth and ever-increasing profit margins from its new subsidiary. To meet Kmart's stringent corporate benchmarks, Waldenbooks had to streamline its operations. The buying process became highly centralized and rigidly reliant on sales data and algorithmic predictions rather than the intuitive, literary pulse of experienced booksellers. The inventory became increasingly homogenized. Every Waldenbooks across the country, regardless of its local demographic, began to look and feel exactly the same, stocked with the exact same guaranteed mass-market blockbusters. Furthermore, the pressure to maintain profitability within the expensive real estate of shopping malls led to subtle but impactful compromises. Labor budgets were tightened. The friendly, local staff who knew their regular customers' tastes were gradually replaced by minimum wage retail clerks, whose primary directive was to process transactions as quickly as possible, rather than to curate a literary experience. The focus shifted entirely from hand-selling a great novel to pushing the latest celebrity biography that Kmart had negotiated a bulk discount on. The acquisition essentially stripped Waldenbooks of its autonomy. They were no longer an independent, nimble bookseller. They were a tiny cog in the massive, unwieldy Kmart corporate machine. When Kmart's own core discount business began to face fierce pressure from an up-and-coming rival named Walmart in the late 1980s, the parent company's attention and resources were inevitably diverted away from specialty chains like Waldenbooks. The bookstore was expected to quietly generate cash to prop up Kmart's struggles, rather than receiving the investment needed to innovate. In 1984, Waldenbooks stood at the absolute zenith of its power, blanketing the nation and dominating the publishing world. Yet the very transaction that cemented its status as a corporate heavyweight simultaneously planted the seeds of its eventual destruction. By selling its soul to a discount conglomerate, Waldenbooks traded its identity for capital. They had won the mall, but they had lost control of their own destiny. And as the retail landscape prepared for another massive, tectonic shift in the coming decade, that Maritolin kind, being tethered to an aging discount empire, would prove to be a fatal vulnerability. As the 1990s began, Waldenbooks was still the undisputed titan of American mall retail, boasting over 1,000 locations and generating massive revenues for its parent company, Kmart. But out in the sprawling, sun-baked parking lots of suburban strip centers, away from the enclosed, climate-controlled corridors of the traditional mall, a retail revolution was quietly taking shape. It was a seismic shift in consumer behavior that would render the Waldenbooks business model functionally obsolete. Within a single decade, the era of the category killer had arrived, and it was about to cast a massive, suffocating shadow over the mall bookstore. For decades, the American retail philosophy was built on convenience and proximity. You went to the mall, and while your spouse shopped for shoes or appliances, you ducked into Waldenbooks to grab a mass-market paperback. The stores were small, averaging between 3,000 to 4,000 square feet. Because space was incredibly expensive in a premier shopping mall, every square inch had to be optimized for rapid turnover. The aisles were narrow, the fluorescent lighting was harsh and utilitarian, and the inventory was strictly curated to feature only the fastest-moving, highest-volume titles. There was no room for obscure poetry, vast historical archives, or a deep backlist of niche genres. Waldenbooks was a convenience store for bestsellers. But then, a visionary bookseller named Leonard Riggio, the aggressive driving force behind Barnes & Noble, began rolling out a radical new concept, the bookstore as a destination. Riggio didn't just want to intercept shoppers who were already out buying other things. He wanted the bookstore itself to be the primary reason people left their homes. To achieve this, Barnes & Noble began constructing massive, freestanding superstores in suburban retail parks. These monolithic structures dwarfed anything Waldenbooks had ever built, ranging from 20,000 to an astonishing 40,000 square feet. A single superstore held over 100,000 distinct titles. But the sheer volume of books was only half of the lethal equation. The true genius of the superstore model lay in its atmosphere and its embrace of experiential retail. Walking into a 1990s Barnes & Noble superstore was a revelation for the American consumer. Gone were the harsh mall fluorescents and cramped aisles. Instead, shoppers were greeted by soaring ceilings, rich mahogany-stained wood paneling, and soft, warm lighting that mimicked a grand, private library. Comfortable, overstuffed armchairs and plush sofas were strategically placed at the end of deep, wide aisles, explicitly inviting customers to sit down, linger, and read for hours without ever being pressured to buy anything. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, and perhaps most devastatingly, these superstores began incorporating in-house cafes, eventually partnering with a rapidly growing coffee brand from Seattle called Starbucks. Suddenly, buying a book was no longer a quick, transactional errand squeezed between buying jeans and eating at the mall food court. It was an event. It was a legitimate Friday night date. It was a Sunday afternoon family outing. You could browse thousands of obscure titles, drink a cappuccino, read 3 chapters of a hardcover, and socialize with neighbors in a sophisticated, welcoming environment. Compared to this luxurious, immersive experience, the traditional Waldenbooks location suddenly felt terribly inadequate. Customers who had spent an afternoon lounging in a sprawling superstore began to view the mall-based Waldenbooks as claustrophobic, sterile, and painfully limited in its selection. Why settle for the top 50 bestsellers under buzzing neon lights when you could have the entire world of literature alongside a fresh pastry just a few miles down the road? The threat was existential, but Waldenbooks was effectively paralyzed, unable to respond to the superstore invasion due to 2 massive, insurmountable constraints. The first constraint was physical real estate. Malls simply did not have the architectural flexibility to allow a 3,000 square foot tenant to suddenly expand into a 30,000 square foot megastore. Even if the space existed, the cost per square foot inside a premier enclosed mall was astronomically higher than in a suburban strip center. The economics of building a massive leisurely library inside a high-rent mall simply did not work. Waldenbooks was physically trapped in a cage of its own making. The second constraint was Kmart. By the early 90s, the discount giant was beginning to lose serious ground to its fierce rival from Arkansas, Walmart. Kmart executives were desperately focused on saving their core department store business. They viewed Waldenbooks strictly as a cash cow, a subsidiary expected to quietly funnel profits upward to support the struggling parent company. They possessed neither the capital nor the retail vision to aggressively reformat their bookstore chain to compete with Barnes & Noble. To Kmart's boardroom, the idea of wasting valuable retail square footage on non-revenue-generating armchairs and coffee counters was antithetical to their fundamental business philosophy. Waldenbooks found itself caught in a fatal pincer movement. Their physical locations were suddenly out of fashion, their corporate overlords were distracted and tight-fisted, and their customers were being seduced away by the luxurious allure of the superstore. The mall empire that had taken decades to build was suddenly bleeding foot traffic. Kmart executives finally realized that if they wanted to survive the bookstore wars of the 1990s, they couldn't do it with Waldenbooks alone. They needed a superstore of their own. And this desperate realization would lead to one of the most disastrous corporate marriages in retail history. By 1992, the executive leadership at Kmart Corporation was operating in a state of quiet desperation. From their sprawling headquarters in Troy, Michigan, they watched as their core discount empire was being systematically dismantled by the relentless efficiency and aggressive expansion of Walmart. Simultaneously, they realized that their crown jewel subsidiary, Waldenbooks, was entirely unequipped to fight the new retail war being waged by Barnes & Noble. The mall-based bookstore was structurally, financially, and geographically incapable of transforming into a 30,000 square foot destination superstore. If Kmart wanted to maintain its grip on the American book market, they needed a new weapon. They could not build a superstore culture from scratch, so they decided to buy one. Their target was a small, fiercely intellectual chain based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, called Borders. Founded in 1971 by brothers Tom and Louis Borders, the company had spent decades perfecting the exact model that Kmart lacked. Borders stores were massive, fiercely independent, and tailored for serious academics and deep readers. But more importantly, the Borders brothers had developed a revolutionary, proprietary computerized inventory system. This system could predict local buying patterns with startling accuracy, allowing a massive superstore to stock a deep, highly localized backlist of obscure titles without drowning in unsold inventory. To the Kmart executives, Borders was the perfect antidote to Barnes & Noble. In late 1992, Kmart aggressively acquired Borders for $125 million. Almost immediately, the corporate overlords forced their two vastly different bookstore properties into an awkward shotgun marriage, creating a new corporate entity, the Borders Walden Group. On paper, this merger seemed like a strategic masterstroke. Kmart now controlled both ends of the retail spectrum. Waldenbooks would continue to capture the impulse, mass market buyer in the malls, while Borders would aggressively court the destination, experiential shopper in the suburbs. The underlying consumer psychology seemed sound, blanket the market so thoroughly that wherever an American went, they were buying a book from a Kmart subsidiary. However, in reality, the merger ignited a disastrous cultural collision. Waldenbooks and Borders possessed fundamentally opposing retail DNA. Waldenbooks was populist, fast-paced, and built on the high-volume turnover of cheap paperbacks and celebrity biographies. Borders was collegiate, atmospheric, and prided itself on an expansive, esoteric selection curated by highly literate, specialized staff. When the two companies were smashed together, Kmart's corporate leadership made a swift, calculated, and ultimately fatal decision regarding resource allocation. They looked at the exploding popularity of the superstore model and decided that Borders was the undeniable future of the company. Waldenbooks, despite being the established massive engine that had historically generated hundreds of millions of dollars in reliable cash flow, was suddenly reclassified as a legacy asset. The corporate dynamic quickly turned parasitic. The massive profits generated by the thousands of Waldenbooks locations across the country were systematically siphoned off. But instead of being reinvested into updating the aging mall stores, that capital was aggressively funneled into funding the rapid, nationwide rollout of new Borders superstores. Then, in 1995, Kmart's own internal financial crisis reached a breaking point. Needing to urgently shed assets to save its failing core business, Kmart spun off its entire bookstore division. The Borders Walden Group became an independent, publicly traded company, officially rebranded as Borders Group Inc. While finally being free from Kmart's discount store mentality should have been a moment of liberation for Waldenbooks, it quickly became a nightmare. Inside the newly independent Borders Group, the hierarchy was permanently etched in stone. Borders was the golden child, the prestigious flagship brand that commanded all the media attention, all the corporate strategy, and all the financial investment. Waldenbooks was relegated to the status of a second-class citizen within its own company. The physical deterioration of Waldenbooks stores began to manifest in subtle, undeniable ways. As corporate funding dried up, routine maintenance was deferred. The bright, inviting spaces that Lawrence Hoyt had pioneered began to look noticeably tired. Carpets grew threadbare, fluorescent lighting fixtures hummed with age, and the store layouts remained frozen in the late 1980s. From a consumer psychology standpoint, this physical stagnation was devastating. The modern shopper is highly sensitive to the visual cues of a retail environment. A dated, neglected storefront subconsciously signals a declining brand, breaking the vital psychological hook needed to capture impulse mall traffic. Shoppers began walking right past the wide entrances they had once flocked to. Furthermore, the sophisticated inventory systems that made Borders so successful were never properly integrated into the Waldenbooks infrastructure. The mall stores were left with archaic ordering systems, resulting in stagnant inventory and empty shelves. Loyal Waldenbooks employees, many of whom had spent decades building relationships with their local communities, felt the deep sting of corporate abandonment. They were forced to watch helplessly as their beloved neighborhood stores were slowly milked to death to finance a superstore empire that bore another name. Waldenbooks had survived the Great Depression, pioneered the mall retail boom, and conquered the nation. But as the 1990s drew to a close, the chain was trapped. It was suffocating under the weight of an indifferent parent company, locked into expensive, declining mall real estate, and entirely unprepared for the digital tsunami that was forming just over the horizon. In July 1995, a bell tolled for traditional retail, though very few in the physical book trade recognized the sound. Operating out of a garage in Bellevue, Washington, a former Wall Street executive named Jeff Bezos launched a website called Amazon.com. He audaciously branded it Earth's biggest bookstore. This virtual storefront possessed no physical footprint, no illuminated mall signage, and no cash registers. Instead, it offered something entirely unprecedented: unlimited shelf space. For the massive superstores like Borders and Barnes & Noble, Amazon was an emerging, irritating competitor. But for Waldenbooks, tethered to a mere 3,000 square feet of expensive mall real estate, the internet was an existential eraser. The entire Waldenbooks business model had been engineered around the concept of physical convenience and the impulse buy. They thrived on the assumption that the easiest way for an American to purchase a best-selling paperback was to grab it while walking past the food court. Suddenly, the internet fractured that assumption. A consumer no longer had to drive to the mall, find parking, and navigate crowds to buy the new John Grisham thriller. With a dial-up connection and a credit card, the book would arrive directly at their front porch, often at a steeply discounted price. The definition of convenience had been fundamentally rewritten overnight. As this digital tsunami gathered strength, the executive leadership at Borders Group, the corporate parent of Waldenbooks, was caught entirely flat-footed. Their institutional identity was deeply entrenched in physical architecture, massive inventory investments, and the sensory experience of browsing. For years, the boardroom in Ann Arbor dismissed e-commerce as an unprofitable novelty, a fleeting technological trend that could never replicate the tactile joy of holding a physical book. When Borders Group finally realized the lethal gravity of the digital shift, they made a panicked calculation that would go down as one of the most disastrous strategic errors in the history of retail. In 2001, rather than investing the millions of dollars required to build their own robust, proprietary e-commerce infrastructure, Borders essentially surrendered. They signed an agreement to turn their entire online operation over to Amazon. If a customer visited Borders.com, they were seamlessly redirected to Amazon's website to complete the purchase. In a desperate bid for short-term cost savings, Borders handed their customer data, their digital branding, and the future of their industry directly to their executioner. In the midst of this catastrophic boardroom maneuvering, Waldenbooks was completely ignored. If Borders, the prized flagship brand, was effectively abdicating its digital responsibilities, the aging mall subsidiary stood no chance of receiving technological investment. There was no Waldenbooks.com developed to allow mall shoppers to order out-of-stock titles for home delivery. There was no integration between the physical cash registers and the rising tide of digital inventory. The mall stores were effectively severed from the 21st century, stranded on an analog island, while the rest of the consumer world accelerated into the digital age. The tragedy of Waldenbooks during the late 1990s and early 2000s was the profound, inescapable reality of being the forgotten child. Inside the stores, the physical and psychological decay became impossible to hide. Because Borders Group funneled nearly every available dollar of capital expenditure into building new superstores, the Waldenbooks locations were left to quietly rot. To walk into a Waldenbooks at the turn of the millennium was to step into an unintentional retail time capsule. The bright, energetic aesthetic of the 1980s had faded into a tired, yellowing nostalgia. The carpets were fraying at the seams. The lighting fixtures hummed with age. The inventory tracking systems remained archaic, utilizing clunky green screen monitors that frequently crashed, forcing employees to manually write down ISBN numbers on receipt paper. For the dedicated employees on the ground, many of whom had spent decades cultivating relationships with their local readers, the situation was heartbreaking. They were forced to act as the exhausted frontline defense for a corporate parent that no longer cared about them. When a customer asked for a specific, slightly obscure title, a Borders superstore could look it up and locate it in their massive back room. A Waldenbooks employee simply had to apologize, knowing their limited, stagnant inventory only contained the top 50 bestsellers. To maintain the high profit margins demanded by Borders Group, Waldenbooks was forced to alter its merchandise mix in ways that alienated traditional book lovers. The floor space dedicated to actual literature began to noticeably shrink. In its place came highly profitable, non-literary impulse items. The front of the stores became clogged with towering racks of calendars, cheap plastic toys, licensed merchandise, and bargain bin DVDs. The institution that had once democratized reading for the American middle class was slowly devolving into a generic mall novelty shop just to survive. The financial dynamic was entirely parasitic. Waldenbooks was still managing to scrape together profits from loyal mall walkers and holiday shoppers, but that cash was immediately swept away. It was used to fund the massive leases of the Borders superstores and to cover the bleeding caused by the disastrous Amazon partnership. Waldenbooks was being systematically starved to keep its younger, more glamorous sibling on life support. By the mid-2000s, Waldenbooks found itself trapped in a lethal no-man's land. They were far too small and cramped to offer the luxurious, cafe-driven browsing experience of a Barnes & Noble or a Borders superstore. Yet, they were entirely too physical to match the infinite inventory, algorithmic recommendations, and frictionless convenience of Amazon. The core philosophy that Lawrence Hoyt had pioneered, bringing books directly to the path of the busy consumer, had been completely hijacked by the laptop computer. The American shopper was moving online, and Waldenbooks was left standing by the food court, holding a faded paperback, waiting for a crowd that was never coming back. As the 2000s arrived, the physical environment of the shopping mall, once the vibrant, beating heart of suburban life, began to suffer from a slow, agonizing decay. For Waldenbooks, this shift in the American retail landscape was not just a business challenge, it was a death sentence. The mall was no longer a destination, it was becoming a ghost town. The decline of the enclosed shopping mall was a complex, multi-layered tragedy. It was fueled by the rise of big-box power centers, sprawling outdoor complexes anchored by giants like Target and Walmart, which offered convenient parking and direct access from the highway. Shoppers no longer wanted to park in a concrete labyrinth and trek through a food court just to reach a bookstore. They wanted to pull their cars directly in front of the store, grab their items, and leave. Moreover, as the American middle class experienced economic stagnation, the disposable income that once fueled weekend mall excursions began to evaporate. The mall culture of the 1970s and 80s, the social ritual of teenagers hanging out, families eating together, and friends browsing for new releases, dissolved. For Waldenbooks, this systemic collapse of mall traffic was catastrophic. Their entire business model was predicated on captive foot traffic, the theory that if you placed a bookstore in a high-traffic corridor, you would inevitably capture the wandering shopper. But when the hallways grew quiet, when the storefronts around them began to shutter, and when the malls themselves became perceived as unsafe or irrelevant, Waldenbooks lost its lifeblood. The cost structure of the mall was the final suffocating factor. Mall leases are notoriously rigid and expensive, requiring long-term commitments and escalating rent payments regardless of foot traffic. While Borders superstores in strip centers enjoyed lower operating costs and massive floor plates, Waldenbooks was locked into high-rent, shrinking mall properties. They were effectively paying a premium price for a retail space that was rapidly losing its utility. In a desperate 11th-hour attempt to stem the bleeding, Borders Group began a massive rebranding initiative. They started systematically closing the lowest-performing Waldenbooks locations and converting the remaining, more viable ones into a new format called Borders Express. The goal was to align these mall stores with the flagship brand, creating a uniform identity. The transition was jarring and ultimately counterproductive. The bright, high-energy, mass-market feel of Waldenbooks was replaced by the darker, academic, Borders-style aesthetic. The familiar green and white signs, which had served as an iconic beacon for millions of readers for decades, were unceremoniously ripped down and replaced with the austere Borders logo. For the average mall shopper, this rebranding was confusing. The stores didn't feel like the beloved Waldenbooks they remembered, but they weren't fully fledged Borders superstores either. They were awkward, hybrid creatures, too small to offer the depth of a superstore, but stripped of the populist, fast-paced charm that had made Waldenbooks a success. The psychological impact on the staff was profound. Experienced booksellers watched as their stores were hollowed out. The hand-selling culture, which had been the chain's secret weapon, was further diminished by corporate mandates to prioritize certain high-margin, non-book items. Employees were given strict scripts and pushed to aggressively upsell magazines and plastic toys, further distancing the brand from its literary roots. By 2008, the situation had shifted from a decline to a full-blown crisis. The global financial meltdown of that year hit the retail sector with hurricane force. Credit markets seized up, consumer spending plummeted, and Borders Group, already burdened by massive, unsustainable debt from the superstore expansion, began to teeter on the edge of insolvency. The mall exodus was now in full swing. Every month, more Waldenbooks and Borders Express stores were added to the list of closures. These were not just business decisions. They were visible, emotional ruptures in the fabric of American communities. In towns where a Waldenbooks had been the only local bookstore for 30 years, the closing of that shop meant the total evaporation of a community gathering space. As the lights flickered out in one mall after another, the brand was slowly dying 1,000 small deaths. The strategy of using Waldenbooks as a source of cash flow to support the flagship superstores had completely backfired. The mall chain was no longer a reliable engine of profit. It was a massive liability dragging the entire corporate group down into the abyss. The forgotten child had become the anchor of the sinking ship, and the end was now not only inevitable, but imminent. By 2008, the internal structure of Borders Group had become a labyrinth of unsustainable debt and contradictory retail strategies. The company was no longer operating as a cohesive business. It was effectively functioning as a holding company for two dying brands, each cannibalizing the other's remaining resources. The debt load, primarily accrued through aggressive superstore construction and the failed Amazon integration, had ballooned to a level that the dwindling cash flows from the Borders and Waldenbooks stores could no longer support. The financial crisis of 2008 served as the ultimate catalyst, accelerating a collapse that was already mathematically inevitable. As the economy cratered, credit markets tightened, and the cost of maintaining hundreds of underperforming leases across the nation became an impossible burden. Borders Group was bleeding cash at an alarming rate. In a state of near total panic, the executive team began implementing a series of desperate measures that only served to hasten their demise. First, they initiated a massive, non-strategic liquidation of inventory. Stores were stripped of high-value items, and the shelves were increasingly filled with low-quality, high-margin junk, discount toys, clearance calendars, and bargain bin electronics that did not fit the brand's intellectual identity. This diluted the customer experience, effectively signaling to loyal readers that the company no longer cared about the sanctity of the bookstore. The browsing experience, which had been the hallmark of Borders and the foundation of the industry, was replaced by the chaotic, cluttered aesthetic of a failing discount retailer. Second, the company began a frantic effort to renegotiate thousands of leases simultaneously. Landlords, wary of the company's precarious financial health, refused to offer favorable terms. This resulted in the forced, accelerated closure of hundreds of locations, including a vast majority of the remaining Waldenbooks chain. The process was cold and clinical. There were no grand final sales or celebrations of heritage. In many cases, stores were given only weeks' notice, leaving staff to pack up years of community history into cardboard boxes, while security guards monitored the loading docks. Third, the company made a series of panicked attempts to pivot toward e-readers, launching their own proprietary device, the Kobo. It was a classic too little too late maneuver. By 2010, the market was already dominated by Amazon's Kindle and the burgeoning iPad, both of which benefited from massive ecosystems that Borders simply could not match. The Kobo rollout was poorly supported, undermarketed, and functionally inferior to its competitors, failing to generate the revenue necessary to stave off the looming bankruptcy. Internally, the morale within the company hit an all-time low. Store managers and staff, who had stayed through years of cost-cutting and layoffs, began to realize that the end was not a matter of if, but when. The corporate culture, once defined by the intellectual curiosity of book lovers, had turned toxic. Decisions were made in boardrooms by executives who seemed entirely detached from the reality on the bookstore floor, prioritizing short-term financial maneuvering over long-term retail viability. The relationship with the publishers also broke down. As the company's creditworthiness evaporated, major publishing houses began to demand cash on delivery for new titles. This created a supply chain disaster. The flagship Borders superstores, which relied on the constant influx of new releases to draw in shoppers, found their new releases tables increasingly empty. When a shopper walked into a bookstore and couldn't find the latest bestseller, they didn't wait. They left, and they didn't come back. As the desperation reached its peak, the company was essentially selling off its remaining assets to pay interest on loans it would never be able to repay. The Waldenbooks name, once a badge of honor in the retail world, had been reduced to a footnote on an insolvency spreadsheet. The desperate measures weren't just failing to fix the company, they were systematically tearing it apart piece by agonizing piece, leaving behind a hollow shell of what was once the most important bookstore empire in American history. The fall of retail chain name wasn't just a corporate bankruptcy or a ledger balance sheet error, it was the quiet vanishing of a shared American experience. When the lights finally dimmed and the last closing banner was stripped from the glass, it didn't just mark the end of a business. It marked the end of a physical space where millions of memories were anchored. We often view the collapse of retail giants through the lens of cold metrics, market share, debt-to-equity ratios, and quarterly earnings. But the true cost of Prosta lies in the erosion of the third place, that essential environment outside of home and work where community happens. Whether it was the Saturday morning ritual of browsing the aisles, the familiar face of a longtime employee, or the simple comfort of finding exactly what you needed, these stores provided a sense of continuity that algorithms can never replicate. History teaches us that business is fueled by the relentless pursuit of adaptation, but it often dies when it forgets that its primary lifeblood is human connection. Brands that survive are those that hold on to their identity while evolving their method. Those that fall, like retail chain name, often mistake their past successes for a guarantee of their future, eventually becoming a shadow of their former selves, a ghost in a mall parking lot that no one visits anymore. When the signs are finally taken down, what is truly erased isn't just a logo. It's a piece of our collective autobiography. We are left with the lessons of their hubris and the nostalgia of their prime, reminded that in the rapidly shifting landscape of modern commerce, nothing is permanent, not even the giants we once thought would last forever. Thank you for walking through this history with us. If this story brought back memories of your own neighborhood store, please share your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one. If you value this deep dive into the evolution of American retail, consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon so you don't miss our next investigation into the brands that shaped our world.